The Library Channel is proud to present the first installment in the Simon Ortiz and Labriola Center Lecture on Indigenous Land, Culture, and Community. This series is sponsored by the ASU American Indian Studies Program, the ASU Department of English, the ASU American Indian Policy Institute, the ASU Labriola Center, and the Heard Museum.
Museum. I'm Frank Goodyear, the director of the Heard Museum, and I'm going to get out of the way pretty quickly so that we can get on with the program. But I just want to say how pleased we are to be co-sponsoring this lecture this evening with our friends at ASU. I want to recognize Dr. Eddie Brown and Simon Ortiz, who met with us probably 6 months ago, and we talked about doing this together, and this is our first venture together, and let's hope it grows to be a successful venture. The Heard takes very seriously its mission to educate our visitors about American Indians, to build awareness and to build cultural sensitivity. And in that respect, this lecture tonight is totally appropriate, and we're very pleased to be the venue for it tonight. And I would like to introduce our friend Simon Ortiz.
Thank you. Kuansi, kaitawa haupa wechtieko. Hello, how are you? I hope that all of you are well this evening. I especially want to thank the Heard Museum for providing the venue, that is the facilities, for tonight's presentation by Dr. Ned Blackhorn. I also want to thank the Heard Museum and Mr. Goodyear for also co-hosting our lecture tonight, which, as you probably know, is called the Simon Ortiz and Labriola Center Lecture on Indigenous Land, Culture, and Community. I want to thank, of course, ASU and the Department of English, as well as the American Indian Studies for really beginning this, I feel, very significant lecture series, which we want to keep on presenting to the public, to the general public, as well, of course, the ASU community public, and as well, you know, the Heard Museum supporters, you know, who are in all the community that Phoenix is. It is indeed so important that we learn about each other, whoever we may be. Zi intus cha atano, como zi ishka americanos, amos hanos cha atano. If we are native or indigenous people, or if we are non-indigenous people, we are nevertheless all part of one Hano, or people. And for that very reason, very central to who we are as people, we should be not just curious, but seriously involved with the responsibility for one another. And this is why I think that I want to especially say thank you to the community of people who you represent, even though you may not feel that you are the whole of Phoenix or the community of Arizona, but you are nonetheless members of that community. History is a voice that is ours, that we are all a part of. I know that indigenous peoples of the Americas have often found themselves to feel that they are on the outside of history, looking in or looking at history, the historical process. Too oftentimes that's the way that official, authorized history has been for indigenous peoples. Well, history is our voice, and history is us as people, nonetheless, whoever we may be, including indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. So we have to respond, with that in mind. And I'm very glad that there are those of us in scholarship, in academia, who have taken on that responsibility of historical expression, historical writing, historical research, analysis, and saying the things that need to be said. And I want to introduce one of those, I should say, brave souls, or I suppose in some ways he is one of those people who has taken that responsibility of speaking for the history that is ours. Ned Blackhawk is a Western Shoshone who grew up in Detroit, Michigan. His heritage, however, is very much part of this region, this area of the continental United States, of the West, and Western Shoshone, because that is his heritage and his identity, which is, of course, necessary for him to acknowledge and realize and live out in his work and in his thoughts and in his response, to that sense of responsibility that one has. Ned Blackhawk is a graduate, that is, he took his PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. He also has done work at School of American Research, or SAR, in Santa Fe, when he was working with eventually the book that upon which his reputation is based to some degree, although books, well, I'm a writer, I'm a poet, so I know what books are, but actually one's voice is much more than just the books that we publish. So our voice is really the voice of the people, the land, the culture, and the community. And I would like to present Ned Blackhawk as that voice which we all speak. So with those words, and I want to have us all please welcome our friend, our brother, our relative who speaks the history that we all speak. Ned Blackhawk, please.
Thank you, Simon. Well, thank you, Simon, for that very generous introduction. It's really been a distinct privilege to have been here the last 30 hours or so. And I'd like to thank not only Simon, but Ed Brown, the ASU faculty, as well as students who've made my visit here so enjoyable. As I mentioned in passing a few times, and I'll mention it again, I've never been to Phoenix before, nor to this illustrious museum, and it's really quite an honor to deliver this inaugural lecture And it's also a little bit warmer here than it's been in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live over the past few weeks. It's literally been sub-zero for much of the month of January. So I know you complained about it being cold yesterday, but I greatly have been enjoying my warm time here. While I'm new to Phoenix and to Arizona State University, having never been here before, Indian studies, and particularly Indian history at ASU, are certainly not new to me. And before I offer a few of the findings from my recent study that Simon mentioned, I'd like to briefly meditate on the really nearly incomparable standing that Arizona State University history community possesses. And I'm not sure how widely recognized the AIS program in general may be in the Phoenix area, but it's a nationally recognized jewel of academic achievement. And I know of no other, for example, graduate program in the country that has trained as many doctorates in Indian history as Arizona State University, especially over the past 15 years or so since I entered the academy. Working at the University of Wisconsin, I see firsthand the difficulty of attempting to establish such academic programs, especially at the graduate level and especially with American Indian students. And it's an extreme testament to the community here to have achieved such national prominence. Professors Iverson and Donald Fixico in particular have given and given and given so much to this field for so long that many of us often take for granted the recent ascendancy and prominence that Indian history has recently garnered. So Peter, I think Don earlier, James writing in is here, Ed Brown, Simon. Thank you all for your longstanding commitments to so many of us. That said, and notwithstanding the growing prominence of Indian history in general, it should not come as a surprise, I believe, to many of us to hear tonight that by and large, few scholars and citizens of our nation have really a firm understanding of the complexities inherent in the Indian past. And I'd like to begin today where my book begins, with the observation that despite an outpouring of scholarship over the past few decades, a glaring absence remains at the heart of the study of American history. Still missing from most narratives of American history are clear and informed analyses of our nation's indigenous peoples. Although Indians are emblematic of America and continue to excite the imaginations of both the young and old, both here and abroad, Indian history is not currently seen as central to narratives of our nation's past as it should be. That's really the central contention of my book. And I have a whole range of examples that I could use to reveal such exclusion. And I'll just give you two brief little ones that are now at the top of my head, or were when I formulated these thoughts not too long ago. When I started graduate school, and I did initially attend the same graduate institution as Professor Writing in, when I started graduate school, we used a very common guide entitled Interpretations of American History, a 2-volume anthology on famous debates about the American past. And out of nearly 30 canonical subjects, the 6th edition, published in 1992, of the same year as the quincentenary, the 6th edition of this 2-volume set on debates in the American past had no mention of America's Indians. More recently, when I decided to teach the introductory survey course in American history, I chose an amazing study of the Supreme Court by a constitutional legal historian by the name of Peter Irons from UC San Diego, entitled A People's History of the Supreme Court. Irons' book is part of that famous People's History series and has an introduction by Howard Zinn. What it does not have, however, out of 85 cases analyzed, is any mention of federal Indian policy or law. Not only aren't any of the recent gaming, treaty rights, or religious freedoms cases analyzed, but also in this people's history, several of the centrally most important rulings of our nation's most illustrious Chief Justice, John Marshall, receive no mention. Of course, Marshall's seminal ruling in Madison v. Marbury receives extensive and necessary attention. It sets in motion, as many of us may know, the entire process of judicial review that the Supreme Court ultimately achieves in the early 19th century. But Marshall's famous trilogy of Indian rulings from the 1820s and 30s, including the famous Worcester ruling of 32, which establishes the entire framework of federal Indian policy and law, are not in Professor Irons' book. Those of us in this field know that Marshall's ruling in Worcester fell on the deaf executive ears of our nation's 7th president, Andrew Jackson, who, in the most egregious violation of the Constitution separation of powers doctrine, that holds that the judicial branch will determine the constitutionality of congressional statutes. The nation's first president from neither Massachusetts nor Virginia not only failed to enforce Marshall's ruling, as we may know, but also subsequently deployed federal troops to march the Cherokee east of the Mississippi. So if this ruling, if this history and their lessons and legacies are not a part of our nation's most important Supreme Court cases, then perhaps Indians are not really a part of the people's history. I believe that we are. And I'm even willing to forgive Professor Irons, who was trained in a very different era and worked in very different times and circumstances. His editors at Viking Penguin, however, should know better. So if we believe, as Arizona State University does, that Indian studies and Indian history are central to a full understanding and appreciation of the American experience, then we must develop alternative paradigms, perspectives, and methods for revising such often exclusionary visions of the history of the United States. And we can profitably turn, I believe, to the oldest or the longest standing colony in North America, to the early American West, and to colonial New Mexico. And the bulk of my study does examine the history of equestrian Ute Indians in and around New Mexico, beginning with the first Spanish documented encounters in the early to mid-1600s. And it is a deep, complicated, and generally neglected series of historical conflicts, alliances, social and economic relations, many of which frame the first 4 chapters of this study, the first 4 chapters which constituted my dissertation. And rather than distilling the more than 2 centuries of relationships forged between various New Mexican and Ute Indian communities, I would like to begin my examination with a more famous encounter. Turning to the summer of 1805, to that critical moment when Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and their federally sanctioned Corps of Discovery faced a growing danger. And as they neared the headwaters of the Missouri River near the Montana-Idaho border and began their anticipated journey to the Pacific Ocean, the Corps of Discovery faced a growing and looming threat. Lacking horses in these northern plains, Great Basin borderlands, the Corps spent several long weeks in June and all of July looking for resident Shoshone Indians to help ferry the riverbound crew and its supplies. By early August, their search had turned to desperation. It's like 6.5 weeks in the headwaters of the Missouri River looking for people with horses because they've taken boats up the Missouri, as some of us may know. And after the feet of several of the Corps members had become infected by various cacti, Commander Lewis in early August took command of a small scouting group to search on foot yet again for possible Shoshone bands, and he notes on August 8th, for example, "It is now, quote, all important with us to meet those people." As James Frond, a famous Western historian, has effectively detailed, without horses, the expedition would be stranded. It would face a second winter east of the Rockies, having recently departed from their first winter encampment among the Mandan on the Missouri River. And moreover, the party had grown short on rations and supplies and was still unsure about the route ahead. As Professor Ronda remarks, the expedition was at, quote, a desperate point. And without horses, Lewis further worried, quote, "we shall be obliged to leave a great part of our stores, which they would cache or bury into the muddy banks of the Missouri, of which he contended it appears to me that we have a stock already insufficiently small for the length of the voyage before us. And it's really commonplace to view the core of Discovery's young Shoshone guide, Sacagawea, at the center of this summer's unfolding drama. Lost, horseless, and facing the upcoming and short autumn on the northern plains, Lewis and Clark, in many versions, increasingly rely on Sacagawea's memory and guidance to venture west from the three forks of the Missouri. They use her recognition of natural landmarks to search for Shoshone camps and fortuitously find their way to her original Lemhi Shoshone band under the leadership of her brother, Cameahwait, whose support and subsequent horses, in particular, enable the expedition to traverse the difficult passes of the Continental Divide on their journey to the Pacific. En route, she continued to translate among various Snake River and Columbia River communities. So while of central importance to the Corps' successful continental passing and its enduring achievements in cartography and ethnography and ultimately in empire, Sacagawea's historical legacy has in fact eclipsed the communities from which she came. Captured as a teen, her biography has brought only partial interrogations into the history of the Intermountain West and to the encounters between her Shoshone kin and their many neighbors. Lost amidst much of the recent fanfare, for example, around the core of Discovery's bicentennial, have been really sustained investigations of the American West before Lewis and Clark, to the early American West and some of its enduring lessons. And there have been a whole slew of scholars working in this subject, but by and large, there have not been many who've stopped really to ponder, at least in really nationally recognized circles, what may have been happening throughout Western North America, both at the time, before, as well as after this most famous of American expeditions. And in Chapter 5 of my book entitled Great Basin Indians in the Age of Lewis and Clark, I attempt to shift the focus of an examination away from Lewis and Clark, as well as Sacagawea, to not only Cameahwait, her original community, but also to the northern Great Basin in the early 19th century. And what such investigation suggests, I believe, is both surprising as well as disturbing. And this is really one of the central kind of arguments of my study as a whole, because far from reaching timeless or somehow ahistoric Indian communities outside of or removed from the continental-wide cycles of historical change, Lewis and Clark, in one of the most important moments of their expedition, encountered, in fact, dependent, fearful, and in many ways besieged Great Basin Indian communities west of the Missouri River, in lands previously outside of the immediate spheres of European colonization. Various Great Basin Shoshone peoples had already felt the disruptive influences emanating from and across various imperial centers, in particular, as we'll see shortly, colonial New Mexico. As they ventured then into territories yet unincorporated and really still unknown to the American nation, Lewis and Clark, like many other expeditions, recorded and became witnesses to such imperial recalibrations. What one sees in the summer of 1805, then, are really ultimately colonial encounters between representatives of empire on the one hand and on the other indigenous groups struggling to cope with life on the margins of empire. Such indigenous struggles indelibly shaped these communities' immediate responses with multiple explorers and later traders and migrants and ultimately settlers, and directed the course of much of Euro-American expansion, from their efforts to gain access in particular to foreign technologies, to their growing incorporation of various outside goods. Various Great Basin Indian communities, particularly equestrian Shoshones and Utes, vied to cement their control over the region's proliferating arteries of trade, of commerce, and of travel. So as we'll see shortly, far from reaching Indian communities somehow outside of or untouched by the cycles of historical change initiated first by the Spanish The colonial change, initiated first by the Spanish in the 1500s, Great Basin Indians, in fact, found themselves influenced by various outsiders, including often other Indians. Like their Ute neighbors to the south, for example, Cameahwait's band straddled the ecological divide or boundary between plains, grasslands, and mountain valley homelands, migrating seasonally in search of game, fish, and plants. But unlike the Utes, as well as various non-equestrian Paiutes and Shoshones, however, these northern Shoshones had access to the salmon runs of the Northwest, and they maximized their catch using nets and weirs along Idaho's Snake, Lemhi, and Salmon rivers. For those of you particularly aware, for example, of the Corps Path, you may recall that Lewis gets extremely excited at his first taste of Pacific salmon offered to him by Cameahwait at their first meal together, which is an almost seeming and long-awaited confirmation of the party's growing proximity to the Pacific. So salmon, berries, elk, deer, rabbits, fowl, small game, as well as bison on the bison hunts onto the plains, combined with seasonal gathering to make the summer, ideally, a time of harvest for these northern Great Basin peoples. The introduction of the horse had also dramatically expanded their territorial and economic range, facilitating trade, travel, and hunting onto the Montana plains, where not only bison but also antelope abounded. And as all Basin Indians, if not Indians in North America in general, knew, in moments of scarcity, horses could provide sustenance and could do so in relatively greater capacity than more traditionally procured foods. So this band had upwards of 700 horses, if you read the very copiously edited journals of the Corps, as well as scattered numbers of mules. And it's the summertime. And part of the reason the Corps has been unable to find them is that they've been out hunting. So why then, according to the Corps' journals, were Cameahwait's people so impoverished in the summer of 1805? Why did they live in such a state of, quote, wretched poverty? Why was their, quote, extreme poverty so apparent that Lewis noted several times and at length that he, quote, viewed these poor starved devils with pity and compassion? How could these communities face such hardships in lands of apparent bounty? He came in the summertime, too. Imagine if it were a different time of the year. Cameahwait answered Lewis's queries at their first meeting on August 14th, and his answers reveal his community's many stresses of living life on the distant margins of empire. The leader of the first group of Indians encountered by Lewis and Clark west of the Missouri River, peoples without whom the expedition surely would have failed, explained that despite their isolation from Europeans, their community had already long felt the disruptive influences of colonialism. Because far to their south, Cameahwait complained, and at length the Spaniards in New Mexico would not allow native people to, quote, have firearms and ammunition, thus leaving them defenseless and an easy prey to their neighbors who, being in possession of firearms, hunt them up and murder them without respect to sex or age and plunder them of their horses. They were obliged to remain in the interior of these mountains at least 2/3 of the year, where they suffered, as we then saw, great hardships for the want of food. But this, added Cameahwait, would not be the case if we had guns. We could then live in the country of buffalo and eat as our enemies when placed on an equal footing with them. This Shoshone group's impoverishment then stemmed not from culture, not from ecology, not from these quintessential ethnographic explanations for these so-called band-level societies, but from really clear economic and military disadvantages. The absence of firearms remains particularly apparent in subsequent Shoshone testimonies and behaviors. One morning, for example, one of the Corps' men, a guy named John Ordway, found himself out hunting and noted that, quote, as our hunter turned his horse off to feed, one of the Indians took his gun and sprang on his horse and rode off. Ordway also noted that Shoshone had only 2 or 3 guns, but no ammunition. At their first meeting, Lewis attempted to assuage his host's anxieties and sketched a vision of an impending and improved future in which, quote, white men would come to them with an abundance of guns, that they would be enabled to supply themselves in exchange for the skins of the beaver so abundant in their country. Pledging his community's unconditional support to the expedition, Cameahwait, quote, expressed great pleasure to finally see the white men that traded guns. This brief encounter lasted 2 weeks, and while of central importance to many narratives of the early West, few have recognized several telling truths that were highlighted among the core stay among the Shoshone. Theirs, as I write, was often a world of desperation, born amidst reoccurring and multiple challenges. Living at one end of the expanding gun trade, while enmeshed in the horse trade, Northern Shoshones had become enveloped in pandemic relations of violence that characterized both the northern reaches of the Spanish borderlands as well as the western end of the northern plains, where the colonial violence from various French influences in the early 1600s initiated cycles of trade and warfare similar to those emanating from New Mexico. And much of the first half of this book is about New Mexican forms of trade and violence and various forms of diplomacy that are engulfing non-equestrian peoples throughout the Southwest. Indians to the Shoshone South, particularly Utes and before them various Comanches, had acquired horses before they did, while Indians to their north and particularly to their east had done likewise with guns. Horses could be bred. They could be gained through trade, raiding, and warfare. Not so guns. Guns in the 18th and 19th century West routinely broke, required constant repair, and most important, were useless without the additional trade items of ammunition and powder. Cameahwait, Lewis and Clark, and all involved understood this essential calculus, so much so that minor thefts aside, once Cameahwait and his community had an opportunity to trade with the horse-desperate Americans, they shrewdly exchanged the one resource they had for the one the Americans so desperately desired. Trading horses for guns and ammunition in late August, at the end of their time together, when the expedition had to depart immediately, the Shoshone raised dramatically the terms of their trade, extracting from Clark alone, on August 29th, quote, my pistol, 100 balls powder, and a knife for a single horse. As James Rhonda O'Reilly remarks, despite their best efforts, the captains did not prove to be especially astute traders. So while I trace the subsequent and much more astute British and eventually American traders who followed the Corps into the fur-rich headwaters of the Northern Great Basin, I hope that a few of the larger themes revealed from this brief, of the book are revealed from this brief historical biopsy. While not an overtly violent encounter, and unlike the many moments of extreme violence that organizes much of this book, this famous encounter from August 1805 highlights, I believe, the various patterns of desperation as well as adaptation that characterize much of the early American West. Using an analytic frame of violence that is not simply militaristic, but also economic, social, and above all political, I argue that the world of the early West became shaped by individuals, communities, and ultimately empires and nations, all of which deployed, utilized, but perhaps most importantly, recognized the ubiquity of violence around them. From the first Spanish governor to launch a recorded slave raid against the Ute community in the early 1600s to the last recorded massacre of a band of Great Basin Indians in 1911, referred to as the Shoshone Mike Massacre, which occurred just outside the town of Winnemucca, Nevada. Various forms of violence not only characterize, but also often explain, I believe, the nature of Indian-white relations throughout the Great Basin. And uncomfortable simply celebrating or condemning these centuries of conflict, I attempt, often with very extreme frustration, to assess the origins, motivations, as well as some of the legacies of these encounters. And the results, as I mentioned, are often both surprising and disturbing. And I could end, or we could, as the book does, actually carry this examination far down the path of disturbance, particularly perhaps in Chapter 7 of this book, when Indian wars and massacres forged the first 15 years of the territory of Utah's early history, culminating with the Bear River Massacre in January of 1863. I used the Wakara War of 1853 and 54 and the various Civil War campaigns against various Shoshone groups as lenses into these later stages of imperial indigenous relations. And we could end our examination here in bloodshed. And we could echo and perhaps enrich the findings of the preeminent Great Basin Indian historian, a guy named Brigham Madison, who noted nearly 25 years ago that, quote, the killing of 250 northwestern Shoshones at Bear River, Idaho was a national catastrophe. It deserves to be listed with other Indian massacres in American history. But even more important, it has significance as the culmination of over 20 years of increasing Indian white violence on the various major western trails. I hope that I deepen and conjoin Madson's masterful archival study with not only Lewis and Clark and earlier American expeditions into this region, but also importantly with the history of the early West under Spanish influences. And I would actually rather conclude not deep down the bloody path of disturbance in a militaristic sense, but at least address perhaps some of the potential implications and political lessons from these violent histories, implications that, like the massacres themselves, often lie hidden in the historical record and necessitate, I believe, analytical attention. So shifting away from the northern perimeters of the Intermountain West, from the Great Basin, from that Shoshone frontier that Madson highlighted, perhaps we can return and conclude with an investigation of some of these potential political implications. Let us end then not in bloodshed per se, but in other lessons, with an examination of Colorado Ute Indian history, one that calibrates desperation, politics, and economics together, and may for some reconsideration of some of the most central moments in Southwestern Indian history. So let's briefly turn, if we can, in our remaining minutes together, to an undetermined period in our nation's past, to a moment when the state or territory of New Mexico has recently been occupied and conquered by the American nation in late 1847, throughout 48, into the 1850s, but then that same American nation has now fractured. And a secessionist movement has been launched across particularly and obviously eastern North America, a movement to which many Western American military officials not only have sympathy, but many of which join. And it's hard to fully, I think, recognize the implications for situating understandings of the American Civil War from the West. But as we'll see, and perhaps already know, some of the bloodiest chapters in Western Indian history are written during this epic conflict between the North and the South, but they're actually written out west. They're written in Minnesota during the Dakota War. They're written at Sand Creek. They're written in Canyon de Chelly. And they're also written on the Utah-Idaho border at the Bear River. So some of the West's most violent and centrally most important conflicts between Indians and non-Indians occurs during the U.S. Civil War. And they occur in ways that I think defy easy classification, because there are some Indian groups who see and utilize the vacuum that occurs with the departure of the American military in the West. They think, hey, we can now really aggressively pursue our political, economic, and military ends by raiding, in New Mexico's case, various Hispano settlements, by attacking overland migrants, by carrying various raiding economies closer to the heart of various non-Indian communities. But there are other Indians who see a different avenue. They see a diplomatic road in which if they align themselves perhaps with that American military. They might have some of their political ends understood. And I know it's not going to likely win, perhaps, me a lot of popularity in certain places in perhaps the Southwest, but if we situate the Utes within this, the Ute Indians of Colorado, in such a complex, we perhaps are not going to have readily condemnable categories in which to ultimately understand some of these histories, and we'll need perhaps deeper understandings of some of these subjects to fully gauge their ultimate implications. And while it's much easier to vilify and condemn, if we want to sometimes broaden and engage, we may have to try to understand subject matters really sometimes on their own terms. And I was really struck and surprised to find not only that the Civil War occurred in New Mexico. I mean, some of you may know that the Confederacy marches up the Rio Grande and they capture a bunch of Union soldiers in a big dramatic battle outside a place called Fort Canby. They sack Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And there's this big battle outside of Glorieta near Las Vegas, New Mexico, where Union soldiers coming from Colorado come down and finally drive the Confederacy out of New Mexico. But there were moments there, this is in 1862, when it might look like that Jefferson Davis, who orchestrated much of the exploration of the American West when he was Secretary of War, and helped chart many of those famous railroad expeditions with the intent that maybe the South could find an artery route for their tobacco, for particularly the Texas cotton that lay rotten along many plantation fields due to the blockade by the Union Navy. So the Civil War in the West has all kinds of potential lessons, one of which is that various Indian peoples serve on behalf of the U.S. military. And the Utes of Colorado and northern New Mexico accelerated their military service throughout the Civil War as both Indian as well as Confederate hostilities engulfed the region. Navajo campaigns in particular intensified, as we may know, due to the unfulfilled treaties, various U.S. land invasions, and Navajo reprisals, all of which broadened the conflict. In September of 1860, when another Union Army expedition departed, for example, for Denata, officials more than, quote, consented to Ute service. The governor of New Mexico then at the time even allowed, which is contrary to their previous policies, 5 volunteer companies into the field alongside Army regulars, with, quote, 500 to 600 Utahs assembled behind him. Ute Indian agent, a guy named Albert Pfeiffer, rode from Abiquiu, New Mexico, to join in, as one merchant recalled, a, quote, protracted war with those Navajo, the outcome of which, as we may know, would become forever seared into the region's history. Union officials had a hard time determining the exact number of Utes in and around New Mexico, and some suggested that there were upwards of perhaps 12 to 15,000. And this expedition possibly included warriors from more distant Ute communities, not only in Colorado, but also particularly in Utah, where I later examined the various Ute Mormon conflicts from the 1850s and afterwards. One report the following year, for example, notes for the first time the presence of 7 different Ute bands, in addition to the original 3, but includes one frank admission that, quote, I've never been able to obtain satisfactory information regarding the exact number of Utes. With the earlier Navajo assaults emboldening them, Utes had learned the value of joining Army campaigns. They shared not only the spoils, but also news of their success. And by 1860, one officer's reluctance to allow Utes into the field had vanished. They no longer set limits on the number of Ute participants, and soon, as Confederate forces advanced up the Rio Grande, New Mexico's enemies now included more than Indians. So, I kind of chronicle some of the relationships that are forged during and around the Union conflict in New Mexico, including the resignation of Taos's most famous Indian agent, a guy named Christopher Carson, which marks really an end as well as a beginning in Ute diplomacy. And I examine in fairly explicit detail the relationship that ultimately becomes forged by this most famous of all, perhaps, Indian fighters with these Ute Indian communities who are ultimately trying to utilize the Union and its officers for their own behalf. And unlike Colorado's Utes, for whom military service became a means to economic and political ends, as we'll see shortly and we'll conclude, the equestrian Indians obviously surrounding Ute homelands, particularly on the Colorado's plains, but also on the southern plains and in the Southwest, suffered immeasurably during the war. We're perhaps not required here to fully relay the defeat and and massacre at Sand Creek, which occurs in November of 1864, the Adobe Walls campaigns shortly thereafter, as well as the long walk and Carson's submission in Canyon de Chelly. But Utes seemingly emerged from the war relatively unscathed compared to their primary rivals. A year after Appomattox, for example, the last Navajo defenders surrendered to U.S. forces, while Comanches and their allies waged the last of their protracted and ultimately unsuccessful military struggles. Furthermore, and this is perhaps, I think, the critical lesson here, policymakers debated various alternatives that ultimately included the creation of a treaty for the Utes that ultimately takes a massive, massive form in ultimately 1868. And Ute faith and diplomacy, which is tremendously tested throughout this period, and I'm trying not in any way to glorify them over others. It occurs during enormous economic hardships. The Colorado Gold Rush has engulfed most of the Front Range of the Rockies. Towns like Denver have sprouted up all around the region, and really almost like in a historical blink of an eye. This territory of Colorado, which was once almost, there were hardly any settlements in the state at the time of the Mexican-American War, except for select kind of various outposts along the Arkansas River, as well as some Hispano settlements in the South. But in almost like a historical blink of the eye, from 1848 to roughly 1868, the state has dramatically changed its demography. The plains have basically been almost entirely, one could say, ethnically cleansed of various Cheyenne and Arapaho and Plains Indian communities, many of whom will flee north after Sand Creek and join in with the Lakota in their military protracted campaigns. Many others will flee to the south, leaving Colorado, except for outside of the mountains, almost entirely devoid of Indian communities. But in the mountains, much has been over-missed and under-recognized. And their Utes' faith in this diplomatic approach seemingly again reached fruition in 1868, when their perhaps most prestigious and ultimately, I think, under-recognized leader, Ouray, leads a delegation of Ute leaders to Washington. He's accompanied by not only Carson, but also the Colorado governor, Alexander Hunt, boarding a stagecoach to Cheyenne, where Union Pacific lines took them east. Utes had again, this is their second trip, the Ouray's second trip to Washington, they again toured the White House. They attended the circus in New York and the ballet in Boston, where they were even received by a session of the Massachusetts legislature. They even felt the mist at Niagara. So for these Indians in unexpected places, they were exceptional not only, I believe, among Indian peoples, really, but among Americans of any ilk. Whether he realized it or not, Ouray, who was born a shepherd, or raised as a shepherd in and around Taos, like many northern New Mexican Indians, Ouray was, whether he realized it or not, one of few New Mexicans to ever tour the East with such pomp and circumstance, and he would return again twice for further negotiations. After 1868, however, much would change. The studio photographs, fine meals, and clothes remained, but the shared commitments to diplomacy soon evaporated from the Colorado territory. And I have this very kind of emblematic and perhaps famous picture of Ordway on page 220 of this book, in which he's at the center of this delegation of Ute peoples in Washington. As we'll see shortly, dramatic things are happening in and around this year, which is a momentous date in the history of the Ute people. A historically momentous but ultimately tragic one as well. Because the 1868 Ute delegation is best known not for the momentous treaty signed on March 2nd in the Washington House Hotel, which created a reservation of 15 million acres across western Colorado, nor for the festivities honoring Ute leaders. Indians arrived in Washington every season, and the complicated diplomacy attending each of their visits was far too much for Eastern audiences, if not American historians, to follow. And the most exciting aspect of the Utes' visit was the presence of their former agent among them. Carson was one of the most famous Americans of his day, enjoying, as some of us may know, almost mythic status. And more than 20 years had passed since he last visited Washington. And the decommissioned Brigadier General, now very ill, accepted the Governor Hunt's invitation to assist in the negotiations while also seeking medical assistance. He succeeded in the former, but failed in the latter. And during his stay, Carson's condition worsened, and the 59-year-old was confined to his hotel room that he shared with Ute leaders, including most likely Ordway. And I haven't been able to find exact information about who slept where in the Washington House Hotel in Washington in March 1868, but it's clear that Carson is on very close terms with the Ute leaders with him, many of whom have literally rode with him in battle. Carson's illness precipitates an early return to Colorado. As some of us may know, he does not join the Utes for their trip to New York City or Boston or Niagara. He returns to Colorado, where his family had recently relocated. His wife was expecting their 8th child, and upon his return, their family experienced 2 devastating blows. His wife, who in her last trimester had hurried over rutted roads to receive her ill husband, died after the April birth of their daughter, and Carson's worsening aneurysm finally burst at Fort Lyon, Colorado in May 1868. Initially buried alongside each other in a place called Boggsville, they were reinterred, as some of us may know, the following year behind their family home in Taos, while their orphan children went to live with his wife's family. The same place in Taos where Ute Indians came for roughly 8 years to meet the agent in charge with their ultimately sometimes political and everyday fortunes. And scenes of the Carsons' death, laden with understandable sadness and remorse, literally fill just about every major account of Colorado and New Mexican history. And they seemingly signal an end to many. Their lives evoke some empathy as well as contemplation. Both their biographies have recently come to appear to encapsulate much of the 19th century American West with its legacies of individualism, conquest, and adaptation. There will soon be a PBS American Experience on Christopher Carson that Professor Iverson and Fixico have been involved in. But often lost in such accounts are the 2 Indian groups most affected by Carson's career, the Utes and the Navajos. For them, the year of his death proved to be a watershed. For the Utes, 1868 brought the loss then of an experienced, trusted, and powerful ally whose support would be missed in the coming decade. Lacking employment, he doesn't have a job, Carson had expressed interest in Colorado's superintendency of Indian affairs, while Hunt, the governor, also considered him for agent at one of the 2 agencies to be created upon the treaty's ratification. The treaty is ratified. It establishes a 15 million acre over what is roughly the western third to quarter of the state of Colorado. There's a map on page 223 of the adjoining Ute and Navajo reservations. And while Carson's illiteracy would have ruined his chances for superintendent, as agent on the Ute reservation, his influence over the treaty's enforcement may have been enormous. Indeed, he might have been able to prevent the tragedy that soon beset his closest and primary allies. I sketch and quote, actually, Professor Iverson about the importance of Treaty Day among the Navajo and contrast it with their northern Indian neighbors. Because as late as 1879, when this map is in the book appears, federal publications included maps of the adjoining Navajo and Ute reservations. 1868 is when Treaty Day is first celebrated and establishes, as some of us may know, the end of the misery, death, and disease at Bosque Redondo, and creates and reestablishes Navajo political holdings in much of the Four Corners region. And as late as 1879, federal publications include maps of the adjoining Navajo and Ute reservations, both of which have antecedents and are ratified literally on the same day in summer of 1868. And people may not believe me when I tell you this, but the Ute reservation dwarfs the Navajo reservation at the time. However, just as their experience as Union allies contrasted with those of the Navajo, so too do Ute fortunes after 1868. There would be no permanent and extensive Ute reservation in western Colorado. Despite their service to the U.S. government, their commitments to peace, and their intelligent diplomacy, Ute families would not remain and flourish along the western slope of the Rockies. There would be no annual Treaty Day celebrations. Beginning 5 years after the treaty's ratification, a series of land seizures and abrogated treaty agreements rapidly diminished the Utes' once vast reservation homeland. Ultimately, Colorado Utes succumbed to waves of dispossession initiated in 1880. The first agreement is called the Brunella Agreement in 1873. It extracts 4 million acres from the southern parts of the Ute reservation, establishing both a precedent as well as mechanism for taking the rest. Bands attached to the southern agency were forced onto a sliver of their former territory, while in 1879 and 1880, hostilities along the White River in western Colorado at the reservation's northern agency erupted into a larger conflict that turned deadly and was used by territorial leaders to justify abrogating the 1868 treaty. Mineral, ranching, and corporate interests soon combined with public sentiment to undermine Indian land claims, while alcohol, bribery, and intimidation facilitated Ute compliance. In 1881, northern Ute bands from the northern agency of the reservation, including Urays, were marched at gunpoint across the Green River into Utah to join other dispossessed Utes on the Uintah-Ouray Reservation. Ouray did not live to witness his people's permanent exile, though his wife Chipeta lived for another 40 years in Utah. And unlike the massive loss of reservation lands that accompanied America's assimilation policies like allotment in the 1880s, the dispossession of Colorado's Utes did not include beneficent claims of civilization's capacity or potential uplifting capabilities. Rather, this removal, like that of Colorado's Plains Indians, revealed, I believe, the triumphant capacity of white supremacy to eradicate forms of difference, as the Indian hating that accompanied Sand Creek again fueled onslaughts against the territory's remaining native people. One historical geographer has compared this process of Indian removal east of the Mississippi to a giant bulldozer pushing native peoples west. And Western historians often relate the opening phases of American expansion across the continent as a pronged process, revealing how landmark treaties emptied the central plains of many Indian groups, driving equestrian communities both north and south, while opening corridors across the land. But such narratives, whether they realize it or not, often end at the Rockies, implying that the waves of removal that swept across the eastern North America failed to subsume Navajo, Pueblo, and Apache nations, whose continued presence in the region represents a triumph of indigenous endurance as well as a failure of manifest destiny. But if we look west of the Rockies, if we look into the Intermountain West, If we look into this eastern portion of the Great Basin and these various Shoshone-speaking peoples in Colorado, the northern New Mexican Utes join the Ute Colorado Reservation. Many of them end up dispossessed into Utah. If we look into Utah, if we look into Idaho, look along the Snake River and examine Cameahwait's communities 50 years later, we'll see them in even deeper forms of impoverishment and dependency, attacking overland migrants in some of the most protracted and difficult guerrilla campaigns. And if we look perhaps to my father's home state, the state of Nevada, as well as obviously Utah, we'll see Indian histories that are not often widely well understood. In the 19th century history of Utes in New Mexico, Colorado, and I would ultimately suggest even Utah, challenges the kind of view of somehow the Rockies ending the phases of American expansion. Through compromise and accommodation with representatives of the American government, Colorado Utes achieved mutually agreed upon constitutional protections. In the first 3/4 of the 19th century, they withstood unrelenting pressures and positioned themselves to secure what they, as well as American officials, either wanted or at least were willing to provide: peace, land, and provisions. Despite sporadic hostilities, they remained committed to diplomatic recourse. There were a couple kind of brutal campaigns in the 1840s and 50s between Utes and the U.S. Army, and I kind of argue that the Utes kind of realized that this is not a viable strategy of survival, and look then at their kind of ways in which they negotiate previously, these kind of diplomatic approaches. If we take such an approach in perspective, one might even suggest that their 1868 treaty, the first ratified and implemented treaty between Colorado Utes and the U.S. government, represents perhaps even the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of diplomacy. If we understood the long-standing, if we had time to relay the long-standing relationship between Ute leaders in the Spanish Empire and government in New Mexico, we would see Ute leaders in the 1700s trying to enact various strategies of survival, like Ouray and those later. And it's not happenstance that their most accomplished statesman literally almost personifies such cultural and diplomatic connections. A multilingual herder from New Mexico is received by 2 different American presidents, Lincoln and Johnson. So Ouray and the Utes' ultimate tragedy then marks more than the passing of an era. It signifies, I believe, the final stages of resolute and ultimately successful indigenous struggles to withstand the turbulent currents engulfing their mountain homelands. The bulldozer of American removal, as D.W. Mining terms it, hit the Rockies hard, and it kept moving, scaling the nation's tallest peaks and descending into mountain valleys in search of the next native community to uproot. The obstacles in its path, however, were not just geographic, but also legal, political, and above all, historical. Confronting Indians who had secured from multiple national leaders various protections which were ratified and constitutionally protected, supposedly by the American treaty process, the ravages of dispossession subsumed the most unlikely, if not unbefitting, communities. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain any potential questions or comments, starting here in the front. You're gonna have to speak up, I think,
No,
for the.
I'm just mumbling. I know that your primary study was on the Utes and a lot of it focused on New Mexico. As people who may not know, I'm from a California tribe. I don't know how much you've delved into the differences, but why would you say, and I'm not sure if you've studied this enough to answer it, why did the New Mexico tribes manage to hold on to their land, to their tribal status, to a lot of the status that they currently have, versus what we know what happened to the California tribes, which is very little land, half the tribes are not federally recognized, the massacres, the public policy of the state being, Indian extermination. And yet we know that the two states have a similar history as it relates to the Spaniards and then the Mexican occupation and the Americans taking over. So why would you say, if you have studied this?
California's Indian history, I believe, remains the least written in American historiography. And Professor Iverson has been doing this for a very long time, and I don't know if he would agree with me on that point. But there's this perception in California and its history that somehow the California missions represent the totality of Spanish colonial history in the region. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that really, like right outside the perimeters of the Spanish Empire, there are worlds undergoing rapid and dramatic historical change. Cameahwait in 1805 is saying stuff that was clearly on the minds of his community for the first time to an English-speaking audience. And people have this impression, what are they, 26 Spanish missions in California?
There's 21 missions.
21, I'm sorry.
But this is not just the mission.
I know, but beginning...
The ones with the Russian domination.
Right.
Then you've got the ones in northern and eastern California who had very little interaction with any Europeans until a little bit after even Lewis and Clark. And yet we still see the same basic dilemma that very little land and not all the tribes have federal status.
Okay, so 21 Spanish missions stretching from San Francisco down to San Diego. How far? Yeah, along the coast. They don't reach far into the interior. They don't reach really north of Golden Gate, really Sonoma. What happens to the state's Indians? That's a phenomenally important question. I think the point of departure could be that both are heavily settled portions of the Western American continent at the time of European contact. I don't know the exact demographies, but these are both heavily settled regions. But the New Mexican communities are encountered obviously much earlier than and settled and colonized and conquered and incorporated into the Spanish Empire much earlier than the 1598
The Pueblos threw the Spaniards out one time too.
well, yeah, and the part of that history in New Mexico involves these northern equestrians, people like the Utes and the Comanches and the Apaches and various plains communities. And so when the Spanish do return, for example, they're much the Pueblos have been kind of introduced to the equestrianism that the Spanish have left and or engendered, and are not necessarily happy to see the Spanish back, but the rapprochement that occurs afterwards is much more kind of respective of various forms of particularly religious autonomy. And so that whole history, which sets in motion the whole history of the Southwest, or much of it within this Spanish period, occurs much, much earlier than those occurring in California and away from the missions. Late 1700s throughout the 1800s, interior California is undergoing dramatic historical change because many neophytes are fleeing the missions and bringing with them technologies and resources into the interior. Some of these Ute Indians that I'm interested in are actually raiding along what is known as the Old Spanish Trail, attacking missions and then taking their horses with them back into the deserts. And so, like in one person's lifetime and generation, you can witness the rise of mission societies as well as their not only fall, but also then the ultimate conquest by the overland American gold rush. So the gold rush, the enormous extreme demographic and violent forms that it takes. There are a whole host of really dramatic reasons. And there's apparently, and I don't know this history as well as I should, California Indian treaty bill that is ultimately rejected by the state legislature. And the state leaders apparently really lobby hard in 1850 to fight any form of treaty relationships with California Indians, many of whom are expecting these types of political agreements that their California's leaders have often explained to them. So I think really deep, duplicitous state rights activists, ultimately various violent in economic processes. Disease is heavily prevalent in around mining communities. It's a really ugly picture of early settlement history, one that I think many of us ultimately would be served learning much more about.
Here I am, guys.
Okay, well, thanks for any other, I know we went a little longer than perhaps expected, but
Don't look like it, so thank you very much, Ned.
thank you.